Hello and welcome to Williams Hall. I'm Chase Engel. Tonight, the Miami University Department of Media, Journalism, and Film is pleased to welcome for conversation Tommy Evans, Vice President and London Bureau Chief for CNN. Evans oversees all news gathering for CNN in Europe, the Middle East, and East Africa, managing 14 news bureaus. During his time at CNN, Evans has led coverage of a number of major news events, including Brexit, terror attacks across Europe, the conflict in Ukraine, and the ongoing refugee crisis in Syria. He started his career at CNN as a producer for AC 360 with Anderson Cooper, and later headed the network's Baghdad bureau. Evans earned a master's degree in international politics from the University of London and bachelor's degrees in political science and fine arts from the University of Rochester. Our conversation with Tommy Evans will be moderated tonight by Joe Sampson, Senior Clinical Faculty in the Department of Media, Journalism, and Film. Please join me in welcoming Tommy Evans.
Well, thank you, Chase, for that introduction, and let me add my welcome as well to Tommy, and welcome to Miami University, but welcome back to Butler County as well, as we'll talk about. I'd also like to welcome our audience watching live on MUTV and extend a welcome to our studio audience here. So tonight, our format sort of breaks into two parts over the next hour. I will moderate a discussion with Tommy as we look at examples of CNN reporting across the globe that he has managed, taking us from Africa to the Middle East and beyond. And so we'll look at those excerpts of those stories and talk about that coverage. And then we'll open it up to questions from the audience, and we will make sure that we have time for that. And Chase will help facilitate that. When we call for questions, we'll have a microphone that we'll pass around. Again, this is a live broadcast, so we want to make sure that our audience watching can hear as well as those of us here in the studio. So I want to kind of start by taking a step back, Tommy. Chase gave us an overview of your career and your academic career in college as well. But maybe kind of an obvious but important question to begin is, what drew you to journalism?
Well, it sounds a bit cliche, but it very early in my career, and I sort of, at the beginning of my career, I sort of fell into journalism. I was living in New York and freelancing and writing and basically just trying to pay rent. And it's addictive. It's you know, there are very few jobs where you have the same type of adrenaline and the same type of pressure, which I enjoyed and strived on. And then very early in my career, 9/11 happened, and this is where the cliche comes in. There's very few jobs where you have a front row seat to history, and you know, it's difficult and often doesn't pay very well, and often has very long hours. But at the end of the day, you feel like you've done something that matters, which mattered to me. I wanted to actually be doing something that was of benefit to more than just paying my rent.
Mm-hmm. How about what draws you to international journalism as an American based in London, overseeing 14 bureaus across the globe?
I grew up overseas. My family was in Asia most of my childhood. But international news, I find the world fascinating. I like different people. I like different cultures. I like to travel. I like going places and meeting people who are more different than me than I can imagine, and yet fundamentally so similar. And I like telling those types of stories and telling people stories. And it's amazing how often you know, conflicts can be broken down just when people get to know each other a bit better. Mm-hmm. And so I think it's international news. It's also just a lot of fun. It's like you get to go crazy places and see crazy things. And again, it's amazing. It's frighteningly addictive. So I wouldn't recommend it to everybody because it can be hazardous to your health as well.
Talk a little bit about, in your current role, based in London, but having to manage 14 bureaus across 3 continents. How do you begin to think about placing resources, and especially in a time when a lot of news organizations are contracting?
Yeah.
We talked earlier that it sounds like, fortunately, that's not the case right now at CNN, but still the idea that that you've got these 14 bureaus, and you've got, almost like, I would think, like chess pieces on a
Yeah,
board, and
absolutely.
you've got to think about how you're going to allocate those resources. So how does that work?
It's tough, and it's what makes the job difficult. CNN is, unlike a lot of news organizations, we aren't pulling back our international reach, but we're also not expanding greatly. I could use another, easily 10 producers and cameramen and correspondents. There's never enough. We do deal with finite resources. I think CNN's quite good that we sometimes project bigger than we are because people assume we're everywhere all the time, and then a lot of that is down to really good planning and aggressively chasing, getting to stories and being there as quickly as possible. So yeah, I'm responsible for 14 bureaus across Europe, Africa, the Middle East. Africa alone is just massive. So I think that the pure logistics challenges, I think a lot of people realize that there's not a lot of good internal flights within Africa, so sometimes it's very difficult to travel. I remember, you also have to sort of think about the world in a different way. For example, a big story in Lagos a little while back, and I needed to get more correspondents in there. I actually pulled somebody out of Rio because it's closer. The closest international city, it's only a 4-hour flight from Rio to Lagos. When we had an attack in Mali, I pulled a team from Paris because Paris is closer to Mali than Johannesburg. That's how big Africa is. It's just purely just figuring out. Geography is, if you want to go international news, geography will be your best friend. Like learning how it is moving chess pieces, getting things around as fast as possible.
I would imagine there's the additional challenge, especially in the environment that we find ourselves in now, that you almost have to plan and then for something you can anticipate. If you take somebody out of Rio, for example, and send them, as you said, to Lagos, then something happens in Rio that you can't anticipate, then you may be sending them right back to where they came from. Or
that happens all the time. The most recent example, when there was a terror attack in Nice, I actually went to Nice myself to cover it, and I remember sitting on the waterfront in Nice on a phone, and my on one phone, and my other phone it started blowing up because that night there was a coup in Turkey, and we'd pulled our resources from Turkey to get to Nice, and we had to turn people right around and go back to Turkey because no one saw a coup coming. It's amazing how often we have massive international stories happening at the same time. When MH17 was shot down in Ukraine, it was the same day the Israelis went into Gaza last time. So it was trying to cover two massive stories in my region at the same time. It can be quite challenging.
We'll go to our first example. Again, we have 5 stories that we're going to look at, excerpts from. We don't have time to look at the full piece, but I would encourage particularly our students to go to CNN.com. That's the first of many plugs.
Oh, thank you.
And look for the full versions of these stories. We're just editing them down simply for time tonight. But our first story takes us to the Balkans. Everybody in this room knows about the influence that, and I almost hate to use the word fake news because I think in many ways it sort of devalues the work that journalists do every day. But nevertheless, just recently, Facebook representatives testifying before Congress told the American people that upwards of 125 million Americans were exposed to political advertising during the 2016 election that was paid for and produced by Russian-backed operatives. More recently, the London Times is reporting that 150,000 Twitter accounts created by the Russian government and sort of released in the days before the Brexit vote in the UK, and having a significant impact on how the UK voted, obviously, in favor to leave the EU. So with that as sort of the context, I'll have you talk a little bit about our first story set in Macedonia. And what's fascinating about this story is, I think those of us in the audience know that these things are happening. We read about them, but in the story we actually get to see sort of the faces behind who's creating this content.
Yeah. Do you want to run the piece?
Yeah, we'll go ahead and roll the clip, and then we'll talk about it.
we're driven out of the city centre and taken to an industrial part of town, all to protect the identity of a man who says he is one of the pioneers of fake news in Veles.
To the first office, lights off. Mikhail has arrived.
This is my page.
He's logged in to his website, and I've noticed that it's not your own name.
No,
It's someone else's
yes.
profile.
That we are doing all the time. We are faking fake numbers to have fake accounts, so I can reach more and more people.
Right, so here you're Jessica. A lot of people commenting, but also a lot of people sharing as we're talking, a lot of people here liking your posts. What are you working on now? What are you looking ahead to now?
My primary goal is to prepare a site that I was having before to be ready for the next election in America,
US election.
in the US, yeah.
How do you prepare for something like that? What are you looking at?
Simply, you need to make million fan page. Like you see, Jessica, it's a fake. A lot of fake pages, a lot of fake numbers, because at the beginning you need to do that to make people like your page. I know how it is to build a big site, and I will do it again. I can tell you how much money I have earned in one day. Maybe it was around $2,000, $2,500 at one day. For this kind of money to earning per day, you need to have maybe a fan page more than 500,000 people.
What makes a good clickable story in your opinion?
So you need to have an interesting topic. Whatever Donald Trump is doing, it's interesting for everyone. Even in my country, everything he said, it's worth listening, you know? He's an interesting face. When you have million fans, if you post something, even if it's not interesting, a lot of them will open it just to see what it is, and you will get money.
You don't know if it's true or not.
I don't know, and I don't care.
Right.
Because the people are reading. Even if they open, I'm getting paid.
Are you proud of what you've achieved?
In 22 years, I was earning more than someone that will never earn in his entire life, with the standard that we have in my country. So, yes, I'm proud.
So again, that's just an excerpt from the longer piece. I'm wondering if you can kind of take us inside how this story, some of the logistics, how your reporter found the source, how she gained the trust, and sort of how you were able to put the story together that we just watched.
Well, it took us 4 months. Isa, the reporter, and I came up with the idea. But we knew these sort of, these fake news stories that were showing up on Facebook. We could trace them down. It was quite easy to trace them back to Macedonia. So we knew where they were coming from, and largely coming from the same town in Macedonia, which is quite remarkable. So we figured out where it was coming from. And going back to your earlier comment, fake news is, it is an awkward sort of statement, because there's fake news like this, which is in this particular case in Macedonia, these are very economically depressed areas. These kids this is a purely financial operation for them. He's making like from 500 euros to 1,000 euros a day in a place where he wouldn't make that in a month. So there's a huge financial incentive for him to do this. They don't really care what they're saying. They just want you to click. They just want clickbait. And they figured out that American politics, especially Trump politics, seemed to generate the clicks. That's one type of fake news. And the other type of fake news is when people, politicians, and not just in the U.S., it's spreading everywhere recently. Just yesterday, the Egyptians sort of accused people of fake news in this mosque attack in Sinai. It's when government officials hear things that they don't like, and so it's easier to just brush aside than actually deal with what people really say, which is frustrating. But this story, so it took us for 4 months. We went to Macedonia about 3 or 4 times, and it just takes a lot of work, talking to a lot of people, meeting a lot of people over coffee, trying to explain to them what you are and why you're doing the story, and the fact we weren't the police. So a lot of journalism is just building trust and getting people to speak to you, especially television journalism. It's really difficult. The camera's not your friend. for investigative journalism. People don't want to talk in front of a camera. They'll tell print reporters stuff before they'll tell TV reporters stuff, just because the camera changes the dynamic. So it took a lot of work to get these guys to open up.
What type of reaction did you see from your audience to this really sort of intimate portrait of something, again, that we all know exists, but you take us behind the scenes?
That piece, the final piece is about 13 minutes long. It's quite long. We ran it on air a few times, so we obviously posted it online. There are people out there who say, that people's attention span isn't great for digesting something that long. That 13-minute piece, the first 24 hours, got something like 17 million hits. And we can tell how long people watch for, and it was something like people were watching, on average, like 89% completion rate. So I think it really sort of touched a nerve with people because it was such a dominant force within the last election. I think everyone here, including myself, you open your Facebook page and you saw stuff that you had no idea where it was coming from. Organizations you never heard of, and stories that were obviously questionable.
Any sense that these kids, really, teenagers in Macedonia, are really now thinking forward, thinking that this was pretty successful?
Oh, yeah. Absolutely.
And 2020 is now on the radar screen as well.
They're looking at 2020. They looked at, there was a lot of it was during for the French election, the German election, the Austrian election. It's not exclusively, it's not just an American problem. It's really a global problem. It's a global phenomenon.
Our next story is a good reminder of the dangers that journalists faced reporting stories, especially reporting international stories. And we might talk about this a little bit later, but the protections that journalists enjoy in this country, whether it be constitutional protections or protections through the courts, may not exist in other parts of the world. Maybe after we watch this clip, we can talk a little bit about that, generally speaking. But this story is a really harrowing story about a young girl who fell under the auspice of ISIS and was rescued. And ISIS, of course, takes its name from its presence in Iraq and Syria. It's worth noting that the Committee to Protect Journalists right now says that those are the two most dangerous countries in the world for journalists to operate. And so let's take a look at the excerpt of the story about a young girl who was sort of rescued from the throes of ISIS, and then we'll talk about it.
We saw these 13 bodies, and we saw movement. Here they are. Look at that wall.
A man, alive, and a little girl who creeps out from under her dead mother's hijab, where she'd been hiding for 2 days, hugging her mother's corpse. They used the tank for cover to move out, dragging those they just saved past the corpses of those who perished. The little girl, she has not yet spoken, not a single word. No one even knows her name.
So again, even in just that short excerpt, we really see the inherent dangers involved in this. So as the managing editor on this assignment, I wonder if you could talk about the planning for what you assumed would be a risky story, and then sort of how this played out.
Iraq and Syria has sort of been largely my area of expertise. That's where I did most of. I was in Baghdad for 5 years during the height of the war. That reporter, Arwa Damon, and I were roommates in Baghdad. You can never mitigate all the risk. It's impossible. We do have, unfortunately, it's gotten to the point that these conflicts have been going on for so long that we have some people who have incredible experience, incredible war zone experience, Arwa being one of them. We have very good contacts in Iraq and Syria because we've been going back, and because I think I'm quite proud that CNN hasn't abandoned that either story, either Iraq or Syria. And so we have a really good network of sort of local support and people we trust. You'll never sort of, it'll never be risk-free. I mean, Libya, My sort of generation of reporters, we were all in Iraq together. I went to Libya, and I lost 4 friends in 3 months in Libya, and these were guys who were extremely experienced. No story's worth dying for, but no story's worth dying for. But some stories, to tell them, you are going to risk everything.
About more of a general question about, as I said earlier, that American journalists in this country, we have the tradition of some protections that journalists can rely on, the court system, for example. But I'm imagining, as you dispatch journalists in different parts of the world, that may not be the case. So is that a conversation that you have in planning or in logistics? You hope that you don't run afoul of a local government, but if you do, what type of options are you looking at if there's not an embassy, for example?
And these days, I'm not sure how much help the embassy would grant us. It depends on who. Most people work for me are from all sorts of countries. Some countries are more helpful than others. Just last week, covering Zimbabwe, our cameraman was arrested, and basically we had to stop everything, and in fact, maybe stop our coverage until we could negotiate his release from a Zimbabwe police station. It's covering international news. We are often in places where they don't understand the free press. The government doesn't want you there to be telling the story. You're viewed as, rather than as neutral, but you're viewed as combatants. And that's why you sort of see there was an era in the 60s and 70s when you see journalists with press written across their chests. We don't do that anymore because people will shoot at you.
A target.
Yeah.
Next story, as we were talking earlier, is actually quite close to, literally quite close to your home. Many folks will remember in June a terrible apartment fire in West London at the Grenfell apartment complex. Took 71 lives. And we want to look at an excerpt of some of the reporting on this. This is a story, of course, that got coverage from news organizations all over the world. But some really harrowing video inside this clip that we'll talk about after we take a look.
Thing around here now that's built that doesn't even have sprinklers, or at least an alarm that worked. All you could hear that night was people screaming. That was it. There were people at windows up there who were just screaming the whole time about, for people to help them.
I honestly don't. It looks to me like it's only the outside bit. Oh my God. Oh Jesus, that's where the stairs are.
No.
Oh my God.
Oh my God.
One woman fears that she's lost 6 relatives, including her mother and sister and 3 nieces. They all lived on the 22nd floor.
How do you want your family to be remembered?
Love, memories, pictures, and everything.
So as we were talking earlier, your bureau in London is how close to Grenfell? Very close.
Less than 2 miles.
Less than 2
miles. It's not far. A lot of people in the bureau live nearby, sort of like the next neighborhood over. London in the last year, we've had a lot of terror attacks and a lot of news sort of breaking in our backyard. And it's always difficult sort of covering these things because it's not just covering a news story, you're covering your neighbors and your friends and people impacted. It sounds probably odd that I picked this story about an apartment building fire. I mean, it was a horrific apartment building fire, but the sort of the ramifications of that, the sort of ripple effects from that fire. It was in one of the wealthiest areas in town. It was run by the local government. They didn't have proper fire procedures, and most people living in that building were refugees, were people who had been put into sort of social housing. I actually believe that 71 number is low because I think there were a lot of people, they didn't really know how many people were in that building. The public reaction almost brought down the government because it was so mishandled. I mean, it just shows that that all news is local in a sense, and yet all news can have regional and massive ramifications.
I wanted to ask you about, in the excerpt we watched, some difficult video.
Yeah.
We're hearing, screams. Yeah. We may be hearing sort of the last moments of lives there, and then the video of the fire itself. So you have sort of internal discussions. I guess two questions. Where'd you get that video? Did you guys shoot it, or did somebody provide it? And then also, what kind of discussions do you have, almost on the question of using that type of video?
That video was shot by actually the gentleman who's being interviewed at the top of that clip. He shot that video on his phone, and he gave it to us. We do have very heated debates on what we use, and where actually, and some places where we broadcast, like the UK, there are actually strict legal guidelines on what you can show and what you can't show. I personally, I tend to feel that we shouldn't desensitize people too much. I think a lot of, especially when I was in the field and covering Iraq, I had an issue of sanitizing war coverage, because I think people then didn't get the reality of what was actually going on. I think that that story in particular, because it was just so horrible and just it was unnecessary that building went up because of neglect. I think and there are hundreds of buildings like that in London that needed to be fixed, so that this didn't happen again. So there was a sort of social imperative to show this is how horrible it was. This is how these people couldn't escape because you guys neglected them and abandoned them.
Yeah. That kind of leads me to a final question before we move on to our next example. Can kind of update us on where the local government is? You're right in saying that the concern, of course, is we have other Grenfell Towers, almost like a disaster, another disaster waiting to happen. Where is that story now for the American audience who may have remembered it, but now maybe not paying attention to it?
There's sort of twofold. One, that a lot of the buildings are being retrofitted and they're putting in fire, sprinkler systems, and the casing on the outside of the building was flammable, and the difference between the version that was flame retardant and the version of the building was something ridiculous, like less than £1,000 a building price difference. There was absolutely no reason why they should have done this. So there are a lot of repair work going on in the buildings, and the political ramifications. The fallout's still continuing. Theresa May's government is hanging by a thread, and this is not an insignificant reason for it. This is certainly one of the massive strikes against her.
Our final two examples, we're sort of spanning the globe here, take us to Africa, the first of which is a story that just in the last few days has gotten quite a bit of attention. It's almost, it's just remarkable to say this, but the reporting on an active slave market in Libya. We're going to take a look at a clip from that story, but I'm wondering if you might want to give a little bit of context to this and set it up.
So, Libya, after the fall Gaddafi, is largely a failed state. It's run by tribal regions, but it's also become the easiest place for the African migrants to try to leave to get to Europe. The closest Italian island is only about less than about 90 miles off the shore of Libya, so it's not a particularly far distance to hit European soil, and it's largely lawless. So a lot of African migrants come up through Libya and try to get on boats. While they're there, though, some pretty horrible things can happen to them.
Let's take a look.
One by one, men are brought out as the bidding begins. 400. 500. 550. 600. 650. 700. Very quickly, it's over.
That was over very quickly. We walked in, and as soon as we walked in, the men started covering their faces, but they clearly wanted to finish what they were doing, and they kept bringing out what they kept referring to in Arabic as al-budaa, the merchandise. All in all, they admitted to us that there were 12 Nigerians that were sold in front of us. And I honestly don't know what to say. That was probably one of the most unbelievable things I've ever seen.
Sure.
Tell us.
I was sold.
What happened?
On my way coming, I was sold. Merciless beating. If you look at most of the people here, if you check their body, you see the mark, they're beating. With electric, even your boot, or they took something like a sharp object. Understand? Most of them lost their life there.
So even in the stand-up, the reporter there, it's so, you know, in her tone, in her voice, so she's almost incredulous. She's here. You know, journalists are often described as witnesses. They write the first draft of history, eyewitnesses to history as it unfolds. But still, it's almost as if, you know, this disbelief that I just saw what we came here thinking we'd find. But I'm wondering if you could talk about sort of how this story, you know, first came on your radar, and then how you planned for it.
Yeah, so Nema, who's the reporter there, and I both did a lot of work in Libya over the years and in Tripoli. And her producer Raja as well and Raja first started hearing these rumors about these slave markets in the western mountains, about 9 hours sort of southwest of Tripoli, and we'd gotten somebody had showed us some very sort of grainy cell phone video, but that, I mean, it looked like a slave auction, but we sort of had to go for ourselves. Nema is Sudanese and speaks fluent Arabic, so it was quite, and Raja speaks Arabic, so, and actually sometimes women in the Middle East sort of sometimes surprises people. It's easier for them to sort of slip in because a lot of times they're just people pay as close attention, and because of, depending where you are, if you're wearing a hijab, it sort of conceals you a bit, so if you don't quite look the part, you have some covering. So we sent them down. They're not alone, but they actually went into the auction alone with some hidden cameras, and it was stunning. It was like one of the things that we, often you're looking for these stories, and sometimes you don't really expect to find it that sort of dramatically.
You did, yeah.
It was as bad as we feared.
In the short time since the story is aired, there's been a rather remarkable response to this. I think this is one of the reasons why folks get into journalism, to try and affect positive change. So, for example, the UN has, just in the last couple of days, has sort of chimed in on this, the Libyan government. So I wonder if you, I don't know that that was the intention for going in, but it has to sort of, in some ways, validate, in a certain sense, what you found and what you reported out.
Yeah, in a sense, it is kind of the intention. You want to, if something's fundamentally wrong, I mean, it's 2017 and open slave markets, it's fundamentally wrong. And so, on one hand, it's our job to sort of point that out, and it is satisfying to have such an instant response, because I think it is one. What the little of the Libyan government is equally appalled. They have a tough time. The country's in a bad state, and they have a tough time running it. But the Libyan officials, when they saw our footage, were as appalled as anybody would be. They don't want this happening in their country any more than anyone else does.
Mm-hmm. Final example we're going to look at, and then we'll have time for questions from the audience. Stay in Africa, a much more uplifting story about really terrific footage, a great television story about elephants in Malawi being relocated to a new home. So let's take a look at that excerpt, and then we'll talk about it.
We're going to start with a group of 4.
The chase led from the air.
There's a nice little family group of 4, yeah?
Copied, on our way.
Capture teams at the ready. This is conservation on its absolute largest scale. A record translocation. Not just a single elephant, entire herds darted.
We need to take a cohesive family group, right from the oldest matriarch down to the smallest baby.
Here she comes. Hold on.
For the continent's most iconic species, the stakes couldn't be higher.
Yeah, look here on the left. I mean, a large herd of elephants. This is how elephants should be, in their natural habitat.
Tens of thousands lost each year, but not in Luwande.
So there may be 20 elephants in a herd over there. They've been so successful in this park in protecting the elephants that there's just too many here.
How do you find audiences tend to respond to stories like this? I mean, sort of state the obvious. Of the 5 stories we've looked at, this one is not anything like the other 4.
And this is what someone asked me earlier about balancing news that you feel like people are really interested in or have to know, and stories that you're passionate about. I think there has to be some light and shade in what we do. I mean, this is a really important story, but it's not all death and gloom and destruction. I mean, it's about elephant conservation. There are some really harsh stats to that, but and going to your question about the resources, that this was it took a lot of a big investment in time and resources to do this story, but it was important to do, and it's something that I think people don't know or didn't know about. I mean, they ran hundreds of elephants in this and moved them into the sanctuaries. It was a really wonderful project and a great story, and it's good to do those stories. And
absolutely. Absolutely. Well, I'd like to open it up for questions. Chase is somewhere. There he is. And so he'll, if you want to raise your hand, he'll bring a microphone to you, and we've got about 15 minutes or so for some questions for our guest.
Hey, how do you feel about the mainstream media's portrayal of mass shooters, specifically with the Las Vegas shooter, where the focus was on the shooter and not the victims?
Could you hear the question?
Yeah, I did. It's a good question. It's difficult to find a balance. I think we could be better. I think we all need to be better. And I know Anderson Cooper, who I worked with for a long time, feels very strong about this. And when he does mass shooter stories, he doesn't use the shooter's name because he doesn't want to give them more attention. He's one anchor on a network. I agree. I think we should focus on the victims more than we tend to. I think that the default to always kicking into who the attacker is because these things are so difficult to understand that people are just trying to grasp at a straw of some sort of understanding, something to make it make sense. Especially the Las Vegas shooting, where there really was so little. They didn't seem, especially in the early days, it didn't seem to be a rhyme or reason to it. So I think that's why there was this sort of fixation on him. But I think you're right. I think we absolutely could be better, and we should be. And that's, the media and news. We're humans like the audience. So sometimes we'll have a human reaction to something that isn't necessarily the best reaction. But you have to reset. And unfortunately, I think it's something that we'll keep having to cover, and which is a real tragedy in my view.
Other questions? I'll ask another question. Right. I mean, we have a good-sized group of journalism majors here, students who are studying journalism. So let's go back in your time machine for a minute here. What bit of advice would you have wanted to hear when you were in college that you think would really have helped inform where you are now? Or perhaps what advice might you offer journalism students today?
I think the 2 bits of advice for the journalism students, I think, sort of breadth of experience, that trying lots of different things, because my experience is that people who do really well aren't necessarily the ones who were very narrow focused in their studies. They're ones who also studied music and played sports and traveled and just took science classes and took English classes and just really had a really, really broad view, because you never know when you're going to need that sort of stuff, or that stuff will help you connect with somebody. And then the other thing is just get out there. I mean, journalism is a contact sport. You can't be passive. You can't let stories come to you. You have to go out there. You have to talk to people. Don't be shy. Listen. every one of them tonight could go up, go into one of the bars in Oxford and just, try to get someone to tell you a story. And just simple skills like building that skills is really will come back and help you 1,000 times over.
Yep. Carolina.
My question's kind of two parts, but for the first one, what is the most dangerous story one of your reporters has reported? And there's a lot of issues that come out with stories where you are going undercover and just kind of the repercussions of that. So how do you decide, especially with like the slave trade story, to put someone undercover and why it should be reported?
The most dangerous thing, I have guys who cover conflicts all the time. That's one of the main things we do. The toughest one I've found since I've been running the region to get people to was the Ebola outbreak, because it was just so much scarier than a war. I mean, bullets and bombs, you can sort of get your head around, and you can there are things you can learn and do to mitigate the risk. The Ebola virus was this invisible thing that would sort of kill you horribly, and it was really, really frightening. And it was that, I think, was the most nerve-wracking. And I never ask anyone to go anywhere. Like, I never tell someone to go. It's all voluntary. I never have any issues with people volunteering for Iraq or Syria. I had a really hard time getting people to cover Ebola because it just was really, really frightening. And then your second question, remind me just.
Undercover.
Oh, the undercover, yeah. There has to be a public service. There's a public service bar. You don't just do it because it looks cool. You don't just do it because it'll make your story a bit sexier. That you have to do it because there's no other way to tell the story. And there's some sort of public service is done by you doing that. Depending on locations, there's also significant legal restrictions in certain places. It can be annoying, but we talk to lawyers. Even going undercover in Libya, which is a largely lawless country, we sat down with our lawyer and said, what are the legal ramifications of us doing this, and is it worth? And sometimes you'll make the call. It'll be someplace where legally it's questionable, but the story is that important that you say, you know what, we're willing to take that risk. In other places, you say there's really no legal risk for it, but you have to have that conversation beforehand. Because the worst thing, because if you do take that risk and then later someone says, well, did you ever even discuss it? If you say, yes, we discussed it, and I felt passionate and I wanted to do it, that's one thing. If you say, they come back to you and say, did you ever discuss it? And you say no, then you just look like an idiot and you're just not prepared.
You had other questions in the back?
I'm curious, I don't need it, that's fine.
No.
I'm curious what your vetting procedure is, especially when you've got the President of the United States continuing, to see you specifically as fake news. And what does that look like?
We have a very extensive vetting process, because the bar for us, especially right now in the current environment with the president, is so high that when when CNN makes a mistake, it becomes a story in itself. The New York Times writes stories about when we make a mistake. Recently, we did have a story that was published that didn't match our criteria. Within CNN, every story that's published, either text or video, goes through a 3-step process, which is legal, S&P, and what we call the ROW, which are sort of senior copy editors, fact checkers. And we had a piece that didn't go through that process, and people lost their jobs. I mean, we take it incredibly seriously because we just have no margin for error, especially if it's anything related to the current administration or Russia. So we take, we'd rather be right than first. I think that's where media has changed in the era of social media, is that no one's ever going to beat Twitter to a story, so why bother? So, and who cares if they beat you there anyways? But what you can do is make sure you've got everything correct, every T crossed and I dotted. It is, especially now for our Russia stories, the Russia investigation stories go through a 5-step process before publication.
Do those include your lawyers? Do you do line by line with your attorneys?
No, not line by line. It depends on the story. You usually, most stories, you'll just sort of tell the lawyer, and then they sort of make the call. Our lawyers our lawyers give us advice. They don't make editorial changes. So they will come to me and say, we're worried about this, but they won't change my words.
Other questions? Okay.
How is your coverage today influenced by your competitors at CBS, NBC, ABC, Fox News, et cetera?
Well, I mean, honestly, at CNN International, where the vast majority of my coverage is, not much. We do a hell of a lot more international news than most of our competitors. We obviously watch what they're doing, and we usually, if one of my reporters comes into my office and says, I want to do a story, and I say, why? And they say, because CBS did it. I'm like, well, that's not a good reason. Like, I have no interest in chasing other people's journalism. I mean, sometimes you have to, but it's not something we do regularly. For CNN International, I think our competition that I pay the most attention to are probably BBC and Al Jazeera, rather than the American networks. My domestic colleagues here would probably have a very different answer to that, but from my position, it's not a lot.
Yeah, Kristen.
Have you ever regretted an editorial decision that you've made, like maybe something that you weren't sure about and then you just ran it anyway and then you second guessed it?
No, not. I've never ran something that I regret running. Again, because we have pretty robust sort of safeguards to prevent that. I have regretted because you can't cover the news like a shotgun. You can't just cover everything a little bit. And you have to. What makes tough editorial decisions tough is that you are often sacrificing something else to do something. And there have been times where I wish I had done more on a story, or maybe got to it a bit later, and frankly, again, being human, didn't realize the importance of it or fast enough. I have regretted that. I mean, my entire time at CNN, I've only had one piece not air that I worked on. And at the time, it was a piece in Iraq. Going back to your earlier question about it was pretty graphic. At the time, I felt really passionate, and my bosses said it was too much. And now that I have a few years distance, I think they were right. They made the right call. But at the time, I'm right. If you'd asked me that question right then, I was quite angry about it. I really wanted that piece on air. So.
Other questions? Yes.
So kind of going off before about CNN and other competitors, what about CNN makes you want to do work for it as opposed to another competitor?
That's a good question. I said this earlier, I think all news organizations are dysfunctional in their own beautiful way, and CNN is absolutely dysfunctional. But I think it's a really good organization in the sense that it lets us, the journalists in the company, have a lot of freedom to go out and do things we're passionate about. I don't think a lot of our competitors would have let us do the time in that Malawi's piece for the elephants. Taking 4 months to go to Macedonia to do something on fake news was a big investment. Especially the last few years, I think CNN's gone through a bit of a renaissance. Jeff Zucker has taken over the company, and I'm not saying this because he's my boss, I'm saying I believe this, and it's the sort of passion behind the journalism has really picked up. It feels like an exciting place to work now. But I don't think we're unique. I think there's some, a lot of news organizations are really good news organizations out there. And we were talking about NPR earlier. I have a lot of friends at NPR, and I think it's a brilliant organization. And I think they're equally passionate. New York Times, Washington Post, CBS, I think does great international news.
Other questions? Carolina. Or like at a White House press briefing. You've had one question, but I'm going to let you have a second one.
I don't need a microphone. Okay. I have a loud voice. What is your process like for selecting reporters? I mean, obviously not just the skills of the writing and editing, but like maybe like knowing different languages?
Yeah, absolutely. Arwa Damon and actually in two of the reporters you saw speak Arabic. Nema is originally from Sudan. Arwa's mother is Syrian. Having Arabic is hugely beneficial, and especially in the Middle East, for obvious reasons. I think diversity in the reporter pool is hugely important, not just because it's the right thing to do, but also it's the easy right thing to do because it actually makes it better for the job, because there are certain people who fit stories and can go places where other people can't go and can get access that other people can't get because they're from there, or they know somebody, or they speak the language or know the customs. So I think that the more, as an editor, the more diversity is, the more tools in my toolbox, so the more ways I have to cover a story. You have to be able to write. That'd be a good.
What's the youngest reporter you've hired?
The youngest? Well, that's a good question. Probably in mid-20s, I would guess. Yeah. And it's, I don't know, age really matters necessarily. I think that's probably unusual, but it does happen.
Any other questions? I'll end with this, and then we'll wrap up. I'll put my academic cap on for a second. Degrees in political science and then fine arts. So we're here in a College of Arts and Sciences in a safe space, studying the liberal arts, where all of our students in this department are required to earn a second degree outside of they study with us. So how do you sort of translate your academic background, and what can you take from those studies? We don't have a journalism degree next to your name, which I think a lot of people would say is perfectly fine. But what can you offer students in terms of thinking, sometimes in studying the liberal arts, how am I going to apply these broad skills to an actual profession? What did you learn in your liberal arts background that you apply today?
Well, studying political science, I think, is hugely beneficial because I do a lot of politics. My fine arts background, I really learned how to use a camera. It was very technical, so I use those technical skills a lot. Being able to write is I cannot under stress that. It's just it's the foundation for everything, for TV, for again, like I said earlier, I think having a breadth of interest and knowledge, it helps you and just makes you stronger and more versatile and just better able to tell stories.
Very good. Well, thank you.
Thank you.
Let me say a couple of thank yous as we wrap up. I'd like to thank the Department of Media, Journalism, and Film for sponsoring our event tonight. I'd like to specifically thank Patty Newberry for organizing tonight's event. In the back, I'd like to thank Steve Beitzel and Ringo Jones and their students for the production tonight. They've done a terrific job with that. And I'd like to thank our students for coming out. Welcome back from Thanksgiving break. Welcome back to school. And thank those folks watching at home as well. And of course, our guest, Tommy. Thank you.
Thank you.
Can I help to cheer you? Ooh.